December 9th, 1957. McClellan Committee Hearing Room, United States Senate, Washington, D.C. A witness sits at a wooden table facing a semicircle of senators. He's 56 years old, wearing an expensive suit that doesn't quite hide the thickness of his neck and shoulders. His name is John DioGuardi, known on the streets as Johnny Dio, and he's a labor racketeer who controls dozens of locals in the Teamsters union through violence, extortion, and murder. Chief Counsel Robert F. Kennedy leans forward, his Boston accent cutting through the formal atmosphere. Mr. DioGuardi, is it true that you arranged the acid blinding of labor columnist Victor Riesel? Johnny Dio invokes his Fifth Amendment, right against self-incrimination. Kennedy continues. Is it true that you created paper locals, fake union chapters with no actual members, for the sole purpose of rigging Teamster elections? Fifth Amendment. Is it true that you have never worked a single day as a truck driver, yet you control union locals representing thousands of truck drivers? Fifth Amendment. For 90 minutes, Johnny Dio refuses to answer questions. He sits there, stone-faced, invoking his constitutional rights while senators detail a criminal empire built on the backs of working men who thought their union was supposed to protect them. This isn't a story about corrupt union officials. This is a story about how organized crime systematically infiltrated, controlled, and looted American labor unions for more than 50 years, stealing billions of dollars from workers' pension funds, rigging union elections, and turning organizations founded to protect workers into instruments of extortion. It's a story about how the mob saw opportunity where others saw solidarity, how they turned collective bargaining into a protection racket, how they built a shadow economy that touched every major industry in America. Construction, trucking, garbage collection, longshoremen, garment workers, hotel employees. And it begins not with gangsters, but with an opportunity created by the law itself. The National Labor Relations Act, known as the Wagner Act, becomes law. For the first time in American history, federal law guarantees workers the right to organize unions, engage in collective bargaining, and strike without fear of being fired. It's a victory for the labor movement, the culmination of decades of struggle by workers who died in factory fires, coal mine collapses, and violent confrontations with company security forces. The Wagner Act creates the legal framework for modern American unions. After the Wagner Act, union membership rose sharply, from a few million in the early 1930s to many millions by the early 1940s. By the mid-1940s, union density reached roughly the mid-30s%. The high point for U.S. organized labor. It's a golden age for organized labor, and organized crime immediately sees the opportunity. Because unions have three things that make them perfect targets for mob infiltration: money, power, and minimal oversight. Minimal law. Money comes from union dues, mandatory payments collected from every member. A large union local can collect hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. A national union can collect tens of millions. That money is supposed to fund strike funds, legal representation, and collective bargaining. But if you control the union, you control the money. Federal oversight of internal union finances was weak until mid-century. Significant federal safeguards only arrived with the post-McClellan reforms and the 1959 Labor Management Reporting and Disclosure Act, Landrum-Griffin. Power comes from the ability to strike. A union that controls critical workers, truck drivers, longshoremen, construction workers, can shut down entire industries. That gives union leaders leverage over employers, and if the mob controls the union, they can sell that leverage. Pay us, and we'll make sure there's no strike. Pay us, and we'll make sure your competitors have labor problems. And minimal oversight means the mob can operate with impunity. In many local unions, weak election safeguards and entrenched leadership made fraud and intimidation possible. Although many unions had formal rules, weak enforcement and control of union machinery let some officials hold power for decades. It felt like a perfect crime: legal cover, huge profits, and real obstacles to prosecution, until public inquiries and later laws began to close the gaps. The mob just needs to figure out how to take control. The method they develop is called sweetheart contracts. Here's how it works. A mobster approaches a business owner, a construction company, a trucking firm, a garment manufacturer, The mobster explains that he controls a union local. He offers a deal. Pay the mobster a bribe, and he'll make sure the union accepts a contract with low wages, minimal benefits, and no strikes. The business owner saves money, the mobster gets rich, and the workers get screwed. It's extortion disguised as labor relations. A sweetheart contract could be the result of extortion, collusion, or both. Employers often accepted cheaper, no-strike contracts in exchange for payoffs or simply to avoid trouble. But sweetheart contracts only work if you control the union. And in the 1930s and 1940s, many unions were led by genuine labor activists committed to workers' rights, though some locals were susceptible to bribery or intimidation. So the mob has to take over the unions by force. 1930s. New York City's Garment District. Manhattan's West Side, roughly from 34th to 42nd Street, is the center of America's clothing manufacturing industry. Hundreds of factories employ tens of thousands of workers, mostly immigrant women, who sew dresses, coats, and suits for 12 hours a day in cramped, poorly ventilated workshops. The International Ladies Garment Workers Union, the ILGWU, represents these workers. It's one of the most powerful unions in America, with more than 200,000 members. Its leadership included committed socialists and labor activists focused on improving conditions for workers. The mob wants in. Louis Lepke Buchalter ran labor racketeering operations in the Garment District, targeting unionized and non-unionized workplaces alike. Gaining influence over union locals could help him control labor peace and extract payments from manufacturers. Manufacturers need labor peace to fill orders. If Lepke can guarantee no strikes, he can charge manufacturers for that service. But if manufacturers refuse to pay, Lepke can unleash strikes that destroy their businesses. It's the perfect extortion scheme. But first, Lepke needs to gain influence over the union locals. His method is simple: violence. Lepke recruits a crew of enforcers, Jewish and Italian gangsters who specialize in labor intimidation. They're called industrial racketeers, though the newspapers prefer guerrillas. Their job is to terrorize union activists into submission. The tactics are brutal and effective. Violence was common. Union organizers who resisted mob influence were beaten, threatened, or occasionally murdered. Homes and workplaces were sometimes attacked, and intimidation was so effective that witnesses often refused to testify. Police often struggled to enforce the law, and many cases ended in acquittal due to intimidation of witnesses and jurors. Slowly, systematically, Lepke's crew drives honest union officials out of power and replaces them with mob-controlled puppets. By the mid-1930s, Lepke exerted significant influence over multiple union locals in the Garment District. He's collecting millions of dollars a year in kickbacks from manufacturers who pay for labor peace. And the workers, the immigrant women who actually sew the clothes, in many workplaces, saw wages and working conditions worsen under mob influence. The sweetheart contracts negotiated by mob-controlled locals offer lower pay and fewer protections than contracts negotiated by legitimate unions. But the workers have no choice. If they complain, they get fired. If they try to organize resistance, they get beaten. The Garment District becomes a template for mob infiltration of unions across America. But Lepke makes a mistake. He's too violent, too visible, too greedy. And in 1944, after years of investigation, prosecutors finally convict him of murder. He's executed in the electric chair at Sing Sing Prison on March 4, 1944, the only major New York mob boss ever executed by the government for murder. His death disrupts the mob's influence in the Garment District unions. But it doesn't end it. Other gangsters move in. The system Lepke created, sweetheart contracts, intimidation, controlled locals, survives. Because by then, the mob has found an even bigger target. The Teamsters. The International Brotherhood of Teamsters is the largest and most powerful union in America. Founded in 1903 to represent horse-drawn wagon drivers, it evolves with the automobile age to represent truck drivers, warehouse workers, and delivery drivers. By 1950, the Teamsters has more than 1 million members. By 1970, nearly 2 million. It's the union that moves America. Literally. Almost everything transported by road in the United States is moved by Teamster drivers. That gives the union extraordinary power. A Teamster strike can shut down entire cities within days by cutting off food, fuel, and supplies. That power makes the Teamsters invaluable to workers, and it makes them an irresistible target for the mob. The takeover begins in the 1930s in Minneapolis, where militant local leadership, including organizers like Farrell Dobbs, builds Teamsters Local 544 into one of the most effective union locals in America. They organized strikes that shut down the city in 1934, winning significant wage increases for truck drivers. But the local has strong leftist and communist influence, which makes it vulnerable. Anti-communist sentiment in the 1940s allows rival factions to challenge their leadership, and one of those rivals has mob connections. Enter James Riddle Hoffa. Born in 1913 in Brazil, Indiana, Hoffa grows up in Detroit during the Depression. He drops out of school at 14 to work as a grocery warehouse worker. He's small, tough, and fearless. At 19, he helps organize a strike at the warehouse. The strike succeeds, and Hoffa discovers he has a talent for labor organizing. By the 1940s, Hoffa is rising through the Teamsters hierarchy in Detroit. He's smart, charismatic, and absolutely ruthless. He understands power, and he understands that in the 1940s and 1950s, power often requires alliances with organized crime. Hoffa doesn't start out as a mobster. He starts as a legitimate union organizer who genuinely helps workers win better wages and conditions. But he's pragmatic. He knows that organizing unions in the trucking industry means dealing with companies that hire mob-connected thugs to break strikes, so Hoffa relies on mob allies for muscle and strike enforcement. The arrangement is simple. The mob provides muscle, enforcers who protect picket lines, intimidate strikebreakers, and occasionally assault company security guards. In exchange, Hoffa looks the other way when mobsters use Teamster resources for their own purposes. It's a devil's bargain, and it works. Hoffa organizes thousands of truck drivers across the Midwest. By 1952, he's powerful enough to challenge for leadership of the entire Teamsters union. But Hoffa faces competition from other ambitious Teamster officials, some of whom also have mob connections. The result is a decade-long power struggle that sees organized crime gaining significant influence over the Teamsters, particularly through control of certain locals and financial resources. The key to control is the Central States Pension Fund. In the 1950s, the Teamsters negotiate pension benefits for their members, retirement payments funded by employer contributions. The money is pooled into a central fund managed by union trustees. By 1960, the Central States Pension Fund contains more than $300 million. By 1970, more than $1 billion. It's one of the largest pools of liquid capital in America. The fund had broad discretion over investments, and enforcement of existing regulations was weak. The mob sees opportunity. Alan Dorfman is the key to unlocking the pension fund. Dorfman isn't a truck driver. He isn't a Teamster member. He's an insurance broker from Chicago whose stepfather has connections to the Chicago outfit. In 1950, Dorfman's company is awarded the contract to provide insurance for Teamster pension funds. It's a sweetheart deal brokered by mob-connected Teamster officials, and it makes Dorfman the gatekeeper for hundreds of millions of dollars. Here's how the scam works. Pension fund trustees decide where to invest the fund's money. In theory, they're supposed to invest conservatively. Government bonds, blue-chip stocks, safe real estate. In practice, trustees were heavily influenced by Dorfman's recommendations, often resulting in loans to mob-connected projects. And Dorfman takes orders from the Chicago outfit. The mob uses pension fund money to finance casinos in Las Vegas, the Stardust, the Fremont, the Desert Inn, the Aladdin, all built or expanded with Teamster pension fund loans. The loans are supposedly legitimate investments, but they're made on terms no legitimate bank would accept. Low interest rates, minimal collateral, no background checks on borrowers. It's a money laundering operation disguised as pension fund management. And it works because the trustees approving the loans are either mob associates themselves or terrified of crossing the mob. Jimmy Hoffa, who becomes Teamsters president in 1957, oversees this system. FBI wiretaps later capture conversations where Hoffa discusses pension fund loans with known mobsters. He denies wrongdoing, claiming the investments are legitimate, but the pattern is clear. Money flows from the pension fund to mob-connected businesses, and kickbacks flow back to Hoffa and his associates. Between 1960 and 1975, the Teamsters Central States Pension Fund makes more than $1.4 billion in loans, many of them to mob-connected businesses that later default. The fund loses hundreds of millions of dollars. And the Teamster members who paid into that fund, truck drivers expecting pensions when they retire, are left with a fund that's dramatically underfunded. It's one of the largest thefts in American history. While many practices weren't illegal under federal law at the time, kickbacks and self-dealing were technically fraud. The FBI knows what's happening. J. Edgar Hoover assigns agents to investigate Hoffa and the Teamsters. They wiretap phones, they recruit informants, they document loans, kickbacks, and meetings between Hoffa and known mobsters. But proving criminal conduct is nearly impossible. Hoffa is careful. He uses intermediaries. He conducts business in code. He intimidates witnesses. And he has the best lawyers money can buy. Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy makes destroying Hoffa his personal mission. Kennedy, who served as chief counsel to the Senate McClellan Committee investigating labor racketeering from 1957 to 1959, despises Hoffa. He believes Hoffa is corrupt, dangerous, and proof that organized crime has infiltrated the highest levels of American labor unions. Between 1961 and 1964, Kennedy's Justice Department brings multiple cases against Hoffa: jury tampering, wire fraud, pension fund-related fraud. Most result in mistrials or acquittals. Hoffa seems untouchable. But in 1964, federal prosecutors finally convict Hoffa of jury tampering and fraud. He's sentenced to 13 years in federal prison. After appeals, on March 7, 1967, Hoffa enters Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary in Pennsylvania. Hoffa retained influence even from prison through proxies, and mob involvement in the Teamsters continued. But the conviction marked a turning point in federal efforts to combat labor racketeering. While the mob is consolidating control of key Teamsters locals, they're also taking over the International Longshoremen's Association, the ILA, which represents dock workers on the East Coast and Gulf Coast. The waterfront is even more valuable than trucking. Every piece of cargo entering or leaving the United States by ship passes through ILA-controlled docks. That gives the union, and by extension the mob, leverage over the entire import-export industry. The ILA's infiltration begins earlier than the Teamsters. By the 1920s, mob-connected union officials already control several major ILA locals in New York, New Jersey, and Miami. But the takeover accelerates during World War II. During the war, the U.S. Navy needs the cooperation of waterfront unions to ensure that military cargo moves efficiently through East Coast ports. The Navy explored arrangements with mob figures, including Charles Lucky Luciano, to ensure waterfront security and support wartime logistics, with early release as a potential incentive. The arrangement is murky, controversial, and officially denied for decades. But what's undeniable is that during the war, the mob strengthens its control over ILA locals. They publicly framed their cooperation as support for the war effort. And after the war, they used that position to extract millions in payoffs from shipping companies. The system on the waterfront is called the shape-up. Every morning, longshoremen gather at the docks hoping to be selected for work. Union hiring bosses, often mob-connected enforcers, stand on platforms and point to individual workers. If you're chosen, you work that day. If not, you go home without pay. It's a system designed for corruption. Workers who want to get picked regularly pay bribes to hiring bosses, a few dollars every day, adding up to hundreds of dollars a year. Workers who complain or refuse to pay get blacklisted. Meanwhile, the union itself extorts shipping companies. Pay us and your cargo gets loaded quickly. Refuse, and your cargo sits on the dock while labor problems mysteriously arise. Containers get lost. Equipment breaks down. Work slows to a crawl. The companies pay. They have no choice. Delays cost more than the bribes. By the 1950s, organized crime is extracting an estimated $50 million a year from the New York waterfront alone. The ILA in major ports was heavily influenced by mob-connected officials, and the longshoremen, the actual dock workers, are trapped in a system that exploits them while claiming to represent them. The film On the Waterfront, starring Marlon Brando, exposes the corruption on New York's docks to a national audience. The movie, directed by Elia Kazan and written by Bud Schulberg, is based on real investigative reporting by journalist Malcolm Johnson. The public is outraged. Congress holds hearings. The New York State Crime Commission investigates. And for the first time, the federal government seriously considers legislation to crack down on union corruption. But the mob adapts. They become more careful. They use more intermediaries. They insulate themselves behind layers of legitimate-seeming union officials. The corruption continues for decades. The breakthrough comes in 1957 with the establishment of the Senate Select Committee on Improper Activities in Labor and Management, known as the McClellan Committee, after its chairman, Senator John McClellan of Arkansas. The committee's chief counsel is Robert F. Kennedy, a 31-year-old attorney with a relentless work ethic and a personal hatred of corruption. Over the next 3 years, Kennedy and the committee staff conduct hundreds of interviews, issue more than 1,500 subpoenas, and hold public hearings that expose the extent of mob infiltration in American unions. The hearings are televised. Millions of Americans watch as union officials invoke the Fifth Amendment, refuse to answer questions, and are confronted with evidence of theft, violence, and collusion with organized crime. Johnny Dio testifies, or rather refuses to testify, about his control of Teamster locals and his alleged involvement in the acid attack on labor journalist Victor Riesel, who was blinded in 1956 after writing columns exposing union corruption. Jimmy Hoffa testifies multiple times, sparring with Kennedy in televised confrontations that make both men famous. Hoffa is defiant, articulate, and unapologetic. He denies wrongdoing, but refuses to answer specific questions about his associations with known mobsters. The hearings produce dramatic television, but relatively few prosecutions. Most witnesses invoke the Fifth Amendment. Evidence of corruption is clear, but proving criminal conspiracy is difficult. However, the hearings do accomplish something important. They force Congress to act. The Labor Management Reporting and Disclosure Act, known as the Landrum-Griffin Act, becomes law in 1959. For the first time, federal law requires unions to file financial reports detailing how they spend members' dues. Union officials must disclose potential conflicts of interest. Union elections must be conducted by secret ballot with independent monitoring. And most importantly, people convicted of certain crimes, including extortion, embezzlement, and conspiracy, are prohibited from holding union office for 13 years after completing their sentence. It's a significant reform, but it's also limited. The law doesn't apply retroactively, so mob-connected officials already in power can stay in power. Enforcement is initially weak, and determined criminals find ways around the restrictions. The mob's control over certain unions continues, though more carefully concealed. The real breakthrough comes in 1970 with the passage of the RICO Act, the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organization Statute. RICO changes everything. It allows prosecutors to charge individuals with being part of a criminal enterprise, even if they didn't personally commit specific crimes. If prosecutors can prove that someone is part of an organization engaged in a pattern of racketeering activity, 2 or more criminal acts within a 10-year period, they can charge that person with racketeering and seek severe penalties. More importantly, RICO allows prosecutors to seize assets derived from racketeering. That means pension funds, union treasuries, and real estate purchased with stolen money can all be confiscated. For the first time, prosecutors have a weapon that can actually dismantle mob control of unions. But it takes time. RICO prosecutions are complex. They require years of investigation, thousands of hours of wiretaps, and cooperation from informants willing to testify against the mob, which means entering witness protection and abandoning their lives. The FBI makes labor racketeering a priority in the late 1970s and early 1980s. Agents infiltrate mob-controlled unions. They place wiretaps on union offices. They flip low-level union officials and use their testimony to build cases against higher-ranking mobsters. The breakthrough cases come in the 1980s. The President's Commission on Organized Crime, established in 1983 and led by Judge Irving Kaufman, releases a comprehensive report documenting mob control of unions. The report identifies 4 unions as having serious organized crime influence: the Teamsters, the Longshoremen, the Hotel Employees and Restaurant Employees International Union, and the Laborers International Union. The report estimates that mob control of unions costs the American economy $5 billion annually through inflated labor costs, theft from pension funds, and work stoppages used for extortion. The Justice Department uses the report as a roadmap for prosecution. Between 1985 and 1992, federal prosecutors bring RICO cases against the leadership of all 4 mob-influenced unions. The cases are massive, involving hundreds of defendants, thousands of wiretaps, and testimony from dozens of cooperating witnesses. The Teamsters case is the most significant. In 1988, the Justice Department files a civil RICO lawsuit seeking to place the entire International Brotherhood of Teamsters under federal trusteeship. The government argues that the union has been controlled by organized crime for decades and that the current leadership is incapable of reforming itself. After negotiations, federal prosecutors present overwhelming evidence, testimony from FBI agents documenting meetings between Teamster officials and mob bosses, financial records showing pension fund loans to mob-connected businesses, and testimony from former Teamster officials who admit to taking orders from organized crime. The Teamsters leadership fights the trusteeship, but the evidence is too strong. In March 1989, a federal judge approves a consent decree placing the Teamsters under government supervision. An independent administrator is appointed to oversee union operations, review financial transactions, and ensure clean elections. It's the first time in American history that an entire national union is placed under federal control. The trusteeship works. Over the next decade, federal monitors root out mob influence from the Teamsters. Corrupt officials are removed from office. Union elections are conducted with secret ballots and independent oversight. Financial controls are implemented to prevent theft from pension funds. By 2000, the Teamsters was largely clean, though occasional investigations and allegations of corruption continued. The trusteeship is lifted. The union, while still facing challenges, is no longer controlled by organized crime. Similar cleanups occur in the longshoremen, the hotel employees, and the laborers' unions. RICO prosecutions dismantle mob control one union at a time, but the victory is incomplete. Some unions remain infiltrated, and the mob adapts. They become more sophisticated, using shell companies and legitimate-seeming intermediaries to maintain influence. They focus on smaller, regional unions, where federal oversight is weaker, and they develop new schemes. Instead of controlling entire unions, they create consulting companies that unions hire for labor relations. These companies are mob fronts, but they're harder to prosecute because they don't technically hold union office. The war between law enforcement and mob-controlled unions continues, but the battlefield has shifted. The days of brazen mob control, Johnny Dio refusing to testify before Congress, Jimmy Hoffa openly associating with mobsters, are over. The human cost of mob control over unions is difficult to quantify, but it's real and devastating. Workers lost billions in stolen pension funds. Truck drivers who paid into the Teamsters Central States Pension Fund for decades retired to find their pensions reduced because the fund had been mismanaged and looted by mob-connected trustees. While not every retiree lost their pension entirely, many received significantly reduced benefits. Workers lost wages. Sweetheart contracts negotiated by mob-controlled union officials gave workers lower pay and fewer benefits than they could have won through legitimate collective bargaining. Workers lost safety protections. Mob-controlled unions didn't fight for workplace safety because they were more interested in extorting employers than protecting members, and workers lost faith in organized labor. The corruption revealed by the McClellan Committee hearings and subsequent investigations damaged the reputation of all unions, even legitimate ones. Union membership declined from roughly 35% of the American workforce in the mid-1950s to less than 11% by 2020. While mob corruption was one factor, this decline also resulted from globalization, deindustrialization, right-to-work laws, and broader political changes. The mob didn't just steal money. They undermined the entire concept of collective bargaining and worker solidarity. And there are the bodies. Dozens of union activists and reformers were murdered or violently attacked by mob enforcers during the infiltration of American unions. The exact number will never be known because many cases were never solved or never reported. Victor Riesel, the labor columnist who exposed union corruption, survived his 1956 acid attack, but was permanently blinded. His attacker was never convicted. The men who ordered the attack were never charged. Joseph Yablonsky, a reform candidate challenging mob-connected leadership in the United Mine Workers Union, was murdered along with his wife and daughter in their Pennsylvania home on December 31, 1969. The killers were convicted, and union officials' culpability is historically well documented. Jimmy Hoffa himself disappeared on July 30, 1975, last seen in the parking lot of a Detroit restaurant where he was supposedly meeting with mob figures. His body was never found. The prevailing theory is that the mob killed him because he was trying to retake control of the Teamsters, and the new leadership, backed by the mob, saw him as a threat. Violence was the foundation of mob influence, and it worked because witnesses were too terrified to testify, and prosecutors lacked the tools to build conspiracy cases. Today, American unions are largely free of mob control. The RICO prosecutions of the 1980s and 1990s broke the back of organized crime's influence over organized labor. Federal oversight, improved financial transparency, and aggressive prosecution have made it far more difficult for criminals to take over unions. But the damage lingers. Union membership continues to decline. Public trust in unions remains low. And the perception that unions are corrupt, a perception fed by decades of actual corruption, makes it harder for workers to organize. The mob's infiltration of labor unions is one of the great criminal success stories of the 20th century. For more than 50 years, organized crime gained significant control over some of the largest and most powerful unions in America. With influence varying locally and nationally, they stole billions. They corrupted the democratic process within unions. They turned organizations founded to protect workers into instruments of exploitation. And they did it by exploiting a simple truth. Power without accountability invites corruption. The unions of the 1930s and 1940s were powerful institutions with minimal oversight. The mob saw that vulnerability and exploited it brilliantly. The lesson is clear. Democratic institutions, whether governments, corporations, or unions, require constant vigilance, transparency, and accountability. Without those protections, they become targets for those who seek power for personal gain rather than the common good. The men who built the American labor movement believed in solidarity, collective action, and the dignity of work. The mobsters who infiltrated unions believed in none of those things. They believed in money and power. And for decades, they won. December 9, 1957. McClellan Committee hearing room, United States Senate. Johnny Dio walks out of the hearing room having invoked the Fifth Amendment repeatedly. He's smiling. He knows he won't be prosecuted immediately. He knows the system protects him. Within a few years, he'll be in federal prison, convicted of extortion in 1961. But the empire he helped build, the network of mob-controlled union locals, the system of sweetheart contracts, the culture of violence and intimidation, will persist in pockets for decades, though mob influence will gradually wane, especially after RICO prosecutions in the 1970s and 1980s. Because the mob didn't just infiltrate unions, they fundamentally changed them. They proved that organizations founded to serve workers could be hijacked to exploit them. They showed that collective action could be corrupted into collective extortion, and they made millions doing it. The workers paid the price. In stolen pensions, in suppressed wages, in lost faith in institutions meant to protect them. That's the real cost of corruption. Not just the money stolen, but the trust destroyed. And once trust is gone, it's almost impossible to rebuild.